Very few guns have reached truly iconic status, although some folks may say that the Glock is an icon. Okay, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But other than the 1911, the Browning High Power is certainly one of the most iconic guns around. This gun was actually designed by John Browning, but the design wasn't finished and put into play until about 9 years after his death. His assistant at the FN Herstal gun factory in Belgium was the, you have the name, now pardon me, my French is not all that great, so if I mispronounce this, I'll apologize. Duidon Save was the assistant to John Browning. After John Browning's death, he took over as the chief designer, modified Browning's design, and actually got it accepted and put into production as a civilian arm in 1935. It went on to become one of the most prolific military and police arms worldwide. I know more than 50 different countries have adopted it for military and or police. The Fabrique Nationale Herstal, that's the national factory in Herstal, Belgium, was the place of origin of the Browning High Power. And again, it maintained John Browning's name, and actually Browning Arms and FN Arms are both part of the Herstal holding company in Belgium. So they're same parent company. But they maintained the Browning name, and it was called the High Power, not because the 9mm Parabellum cartridge, 9mm Luger cartridge, designed by, I think it was George Luger back in the early part of the 20th century, not because that was so powerful, but because this gun had a 13-round magazine in it, which was more power than what you got, or at least more shots than what you got out of your average firearm at the time. So therefore, it was high power, mainly high capacity. So FN made this gun up through, well, from 1935 up through 2018, and it's an expensive gun to make. It's all metal frame, metal slide, a lot of hand fitting on this, a lot of parts, and not inexpensive to make, not when you figure that you can pick up a Glock for less than half the price, or about half the price of what was then the new Browning High Power. So in 2018 they discontinued it, and well, of course there was still a demand for it, so some companies stepped in to fill the gap. Initially Girsan and Tissas jumped into it, and of course then Springfield followed shortly thereafter with their SA-35, and the Girsan and the Tissas, if you can find one nowadays, they're more expensive, but initially they were lower priced than even a Glock. Springfield came along and it was a little higher price than a Glock, but still a lot less than the FN, and they were pretty true to the original design of the original High Power. Well, FN realized that, wait a minute, there's still a market for this, and they couldn't just dust off the plans of the original Browning High Power and put it back out again. Again, expensive gun to produce, and there's already companies doing it for half the price, so they had to make some changes. Enter the new FN High Power. And there are a number of differences between the new one and the original one, and we are going to get into those momentarily. All right, thanks for joining me while we take a look at the new FN High Power. And yes, there are a lot of differences compared to the, this one is made in 1983, so this one's about a 40-year-old High Power, still in excellent condition. That's on loan from a friend of mine. At first glance, they do look very, very similar. They've got the same kind of cut area in the barrel here that has become a trademark of the High Power. Same basic design, same basic grip angle, slight swell to the grip. Trigger guard looks the same. Slide is got some differences, and of course you can see hammer differences between the two. Manual safety on both, and some differences there, which we're going to get into momentarily. The takedown or slide stop lever, actually it's not the takedown lever on this, it is the takedown lever here, but the slide stop or slide release lever looks very similar. Trigger shape is similar, a lot of similarities. However, when you look at it from the top, you can see there is a difference. The new FN High Power is a fatter gun than the original. You can see the ejection port is goes all the way through the top of the slide, whereas the original is a much smaller ejection port. Does that make a huge difference in reliability? I'm not convinced that it does, but it's also little fatter in the hind end. Definitely a different beast, and it's also a little bit longer. The new FN is just a little bit longer than the old. Now, some of that has to do with capacity, obviously, because the original was 13 rounds in a magazine that, by the way, has an interesting little spring design on the bottom, so that it does kind of shoot the magazine out. But that was a 13 round magazine, whereas the new one has a 17 round mag, and obviously a slightly longer magazine, hence a slightly longer frame. Now, I guess my friend also had a 24 round magazine for his original Browning, but obviously doesn't fit flush. So a lot of changes. The magazines are not interchangeable. The new magazine will not fit or not lock into the old gun, and the original magazine won't fit into the new FN. The later models of the original high power had an ambidextrous safety, as does the new FN. A difference on this, though, is, and this is one of the complaints that I've seen online about this, is the right side of the ambidextrous safety on the new one does have a fair amount of play in it. It doesn't feel real solid. And actually, this has just got a roll pin that goes through there to hold the safety lever onto the axle, and it just doesn't seem solid. Whereas the safety on the original one is every bit as solid on the right side as it is on the left. As long as we're on the right, you can see that there is an external extractor on the original, and there is back to an internal extractor on the clone. Now, some people say, well, gee, external extractor, no, John Browning always wanted internal. Well, some of these other manufacturers have made internal extractors in the high power, but again, the original design was with an external extractor, which is, in a lot of ways, is a little easier to tune, so a change there. Big changes in weights. The new high power is not just a bigger gun, but it's a heavier gun, and empty, it weighs 34.3 ounces compared to 29.6 ounces for the original. Again, this is a 1983 version. They may change a little bit in the various models that the high power came in for, just under a century there. Now, loaded up with 13 plus 1 rounds, so 14 rounds total of 124 grain ammunition. For the original is 38.6 ounces. When you fully load the new one with 17 plus 1, you got 44.7 ounces. So again, it is a heavier gun, it's a larger gun, and definitely a beefier gun. Does not fit in the same holster as the original does. Still no rail on either one. You can't get the new one with the rail. You'll see a difference in the finish, though. Some of these, the earlier ones, came out with a really nice royal blue finish, but that was, again, labor intensive to polish it out. A lot of chemicals involved, and it's not the finish doesn't wear anywhere near as well as some of the more modern finishes. This one's got a polished black finish, but again, it's got a good sort of not really a matte shine, but not a super glossy shine like some of the royal blues. Whereas the new one is just it's a dull matte PVD finish, but you can also get this in what they call flat dark earth, which, if you've ever been to farm country, is nowhere near dark earth. It's more like sand around here. It also comes in stainless steel, but you can't get it in a nice polished blue finish or even a polished black finish like you could on the original one. And as I mentioned, this is ambidextrous safety, but it's also got an ambidextrous slide release, which you don't find on the original, so that's certainly a nice addition. And the original also had a magazine disconnect. Right now, and again, the firearm is empty, but pop the safety off. You cannot fire the original, can't pull the trigger on the original unless you insert a magazine. That's the only way to fire this. Now, the new one has, of course, a positive safety on it, but it also easy to fire, no magazine in it. So they got rid of the magazine disconnect. One other thing, and we'll talk about this when we take it down, we field strip it briefly. There was no firing pin safety or no firing pin block on the original one. Now, you can drop this and theoretically have a discharge just by the inertia of the firing pin. That has been rectified again in the new one. And also, finally, the magazine release is reversible on the new one, where it definitely is not on the original. Now, when you see this original I have here in front of me, you'll see Nighthawk grips on it. Nighthawk Custom actually did a run of high powers that they tuned up and made very, very nice guns out of them. Of course, it's a nice gun to start with, but this was not one of those. Just my friend Jim put Nighthawk grips on it just because they do look nice. So speaking of grips, the new one comes with the black plastic, or I think they say they're G10 grips, but also comes with a second set of tan plastic or G10 type grips that you can switch to make them look a little more like wood, but it's still not wood, it's still plastic. So you get two grips. You get a nice carrying case, by the way, and it does come with 2 magazines, whereas the original one, 1983, came in a nice plastic box with also 2 magazines, your usual stuff on it. Now this one also has, the original one, has a set of Trijicon 3-dot night sights. I'm not a big fan of 3-dot sights, but night sights are nice. Whereas the original comes one way, and that is with a blackout front and rear sight, which for me is fine. That's my preference in sights, but it's not everybody's. But that's the only way you can get those. Now, I believe you can still get aftermarket sights for these. I'm sure they'll be available at some point if they aren't already. The original was made in Belgium. It is a Belgium Browning, and then again they made them in Canada for a while. They've had a couple other factories around the world, but Belgium is the original, whereas the new one is made in Columbia, South Carolina. The disassembly is substantially different between the two, however. For the original Browning, lock the slide, in order to lock it back, by the way, this is really tough to cock the gun to run the slide when the hammer is forward. There's a lot of pressure in that hammer. By the way, that hammer can also give you hammer bite. I don't know if you can see it here or not, but there is still a scar right there. That's from a Colt, not a Browning. That was actually from part 1 of my Great Affordable 1911 series. But hammer bite is, especially when you shoot with a high grip like I do, is a real thing on some of the originals. You don't have that with a ring hammer and a slightly extended beaver tail on the new FN. So anyway, to take it down for field stripping, lock the slide back with the safety up into that locking notch. Then it's a matter of pushing the takedown lever out, hang on to the slide tight because it is spring loaded, pull the safety down, and the slide comes off. You'll see a metal guide rod and non-captured single spring in there. A little different on the end, but that helps seat that in the barrel, and the barrel comes out the back like modern pistols, and you'll see locking lugs on the top of the barrel. Whereas on the new one, the takedown lever is separate from the slide stop lever, so you lock it back with the slide stop lever, push the takedown lever down, and again hang on to the slide, and it comes right off. A plastic guide rod, again non-captured recoil spring, and here's where you see some of the major differences. No locking lugs on the top. A lot of modern pistols, the Glock comes to mind, do not use the Browning design locking lugs that are really a carryover from the 1911. In fact, that was part of the 1911 patent, and that's why they had to wait till that patent expired before they incorporated some of those designs in the high power. Whereas the new one locks up on the chamber hood, and that locks into the slide. Kimber locks it up in 4 places, and they say it's their 4-point locking or whatever. At least I think that's Kimber that does that. Maybe it's, take it back, maybe it's Sky. Anyway, they're different. So this is more like the modern one without the locking lugs. It works just as well. We'll talk about accuracy here in a couple of minutes. Some differences there. Definitely on the inside of the slide, again, you can see that the new FN slide is a lot beefier and wider than the old one. And you can see this little device right in here is actually the firing pin safety, or firing pin block. So as the trigger is pressed, this moves up. You can just barely see it moving up in the rear, and that then clears the firing pin so the firing pin can go forward. Whereas if the trigger is not pressed, you have the firing pin safety, whereas the old one does not have that. And again, quite a bit of difference in the bottom of the slide. The slide is actually even longer, even though the barrels are the same. They're supposed to be the same 4.7 inches, and put them top to bottom, they are the same. Barrel's a little bit beefier also on the new one. Now the old one also came in 40 caliber. This one is of course 9mm. You can see the lug, or the locking areas on the bottom are also substantially different. So there's really not anything that's the same between the old high power and the new one. And again, it would have been real easy for FN to just dust off the prints from the old one and say, hey, we're going to make a new gun, but make the old one again. But that's not what they ended up doing. Let's see, partial frame rails on both. Extractor is different. Trigger mechanism is different. Again, lots of differences inside. There's more meat, if you will, to the new one. The dust cover on it, you can actually see some machine marks on the dust cover on the original, whereas it's a much thinner dust cover on the new one. We get these back together and we'll talk about it just a little bit more and talk about some of the shooting aspects of both guns. All right, again, fairly simple reassembly on the old one. And even a little simpler on the new one. You'll also notice that the trademark Browning or high power type of cut is longer farther back on the original than it is on the new one. Again, this new one just looks bulkier. A couple other differences. There's no checkering, just totally smooth front strap, back strap on the original, whereas you do have some sort of a checkering. This is just a machine cut checkering, and it's almost like raised, not really checkered. Yeah, it is cut somewhat in there, but it seems to be more raised, kind of reverse stippling, front and back. Good traction, but then again, never had any problem with the original one slipping out of the hand. Of course, I never fired the original one with wet hands either. And one other thing that just feels different, the original, of course, it's a lighter gun, and it just feels better in the hand. The new one feels bigger. Of course, it is bigger and beefier, but trigger difference. Now, there's only about 0.05 of an inch difference in the measurement from the back strap, the depression on the back strap to the trigger itself in the resting position. However, there's a lot of take up on the original. In fact, even cock the hammer, and there's still a fair amount of take up before you get to what some people would call the wall on the original, and very little take up, or at least less take up on the new one. So that reach feels a little bit different, even though it's only 0.05 of an inch longer on this one for the resting trigger. Once you get to the take up, there is actually 1/10 of an inch longer on the new one. Again, there's less take up between the two, so that actually makes the gun feel a little bit bigger in the hand. So again, feel is subjective, I know, but just something about the classic feels, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm more used to it. The new gun's nice, it just feels a little bulkier. Gotta have them both. Also, the sight radius is a little different, even though it's a 4.7 inch barrel on both of them. The sight radius, when you land at the back of the slides on each one, the sight radius is a little bit longer. In fact, I put back sight to back sight. You can see there's almost a 1/2 inch difference in sight radius on the new one versus the long one, or the original one. So it's again a longer sight radius, slightly longer slide. Just totally different design, while still maintaining a lot of the classics of the or a lot of the features of the original classic type design. And boy, just cocking the hammer on this one is a lot of force necessary, whereas cocking the hammer on the new one, nice and easy. So again, interior or internal design differences. So I took both of these out of the range, firing some the same ammunition out of it. I was firing 115 grain Fiocchi for the most part. I did fire some 124s out of it, and after putting them up on a paper target, I'm not going to bother to show the paper target here, but the new one was shooting below point of impact, but a good tight group. The Jim's gun here, the original 1983 version with the Trijicon sights on it, was right on point of aim, point of impact with 115 and 124. Usually 124 will print a little higher, but they were pretty close on this one. So that one was right on. So I had to aim over my target just a little bit, particularly you'll see it out here at 50 yards, and I'll run through the, well, I've already been running through some of the video footage of shooting as we've been going through this. But the 50-yard accuracy, actually the 15-yard accuracy when I put them on paper was a little better with the new gun, not quite as good with the original 1983. But my 50-yard accuracy, for some reason, I was doing better with the original one. And there's two differences in how they shoot. Obviously, the new one is it's a heavier gun, and it was a softer shooting gun, and a lot of that's due to the weight of the gun. But the biggest difference to me was the trigger. The triggers on these are substantially different. I've seen some reports on original high powers with triggers as high as 9 pounds. It's a single action gun, pivoting type trigger, and a 9-pound trigger in single action is, to me, woefully unacceptable. Again, magazine, because that's the only way you can fire it. There's a lot of take up because it is, again, a pivoting trigger, and a very clean, crisp trigger, no over travel. And on a 5-pound average, or excuse me, a 5-pull average, this trigger came out to 3 pounds, 6.8 ounces as an average over those 5. So a very decent trigger pull, certainly not the 9 that they have some others. So reset. Is non-detectable in the original one, and there's obviously a lot of take up. So, and again, people talk about shooting to the reset. Under stress, hopefully you're not going to shoot to the reset. It's too easy to short stroke the trigger. All right, so a decent trigger on this particular sample. Now on the new one, really nice trigger. There's less take up. It's a clean, crisp break, and there's just the tiniest amount of over travel, but not much. This one comes out, believe it or not, at 2 pounds, 3 ounces. On a 5-pull average. Very, very nice trigger. These are both flat, or excuse me, non-serrated, polished off triggers. Much nicer trigger in the new one than in the old one. And I think that helped make the close range accuracy. And again, I don't know what happened at 50 yards where I wasn't able to get the 6-inch plate quite as consistently. I think a lot of that was mainly in holdover because, again, the point of aim was higher than point of impact. So I like the feel of the new one. Again, but just something about the classic, man, I just wish, well, I know why they didn't, but it would have been nice if FN had just kept on producing the original high power. I like the lines. I like the fact it's just a little smaller, a little slimmer, but this one's got a better trigger and it's a softer recoil, easier to take down. A lot of things to like about it. So it's back on the market from FN. It's not the original. You want the original, go find a Gerson or even the Springfield SA35. And again, they're not even fully original. Some of the parts are interchangeable. There are differences in those. You can see other videos comparing the SA35 Springfield, which is going to be about 2/3 the price of the new FN. So I'm glad to see FN came back out with the high power. I understand why they made the changes. Still just something nostalgic about the original one. Actually, the way to do it is have one of each. So a slightly longer video than I have been doing lately, but again, I have a tendency to do that when I go into comparisons. So thanks for sticking with me.